Right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for attending this second European Encounters in Bilbao. We continue the program. Well, first of all, I would like to say that I'm very glad, I'm very thankful to the organizers of this event for this chance to chair this panel on democratic legitimacy of a diverse Europe. And of course, I am also very honored to moderate the two speakers of this panel. Well, just as a brief introduction to this panel, I would like to focus on the two key words of the title of this panel, democratic legitimacy and diverse. Because I think the two words identify in the EU. Diversity, heterogeneity is one of the main features of the current EU. The current EU is very heterogeneous, indeed, from all points of view, economic, political, social, cultural. Diversity is a richness, but at the same time, it's also a difficulty. It's a difficulty for all member states, to move forward all together and at the same time. Presently, member states don't have the same approaches on European issues. And this is a difficulty to work together, as it is evident nowadays. So diversity, democratic legitimacy. Of course, the EU, the current EU, has many elements, dimensions of democratic legitimacy. But it also lacks, it also shows relevant shortcomings in terms of democracy. In my view, one of the most relevant democratic shortcomings is the lack of popular support, the distance between the EU and citizens who one day should become the European Union demos, its demos. Well, on the basis of these simple ideas, I thought we could wonder, just as a start, just to start this panel, whether it is possible a new narrative, a new paradigm of union, given the different approaches among member states on how to construct Europe. Is it still feasible to foster trust in the EU, despite the multi-dimensional crisis it is presently going through? Well, we hope to find some answers from the speakers' intervention as well from your contribution. Well, I am very honored to introduce both speakers and to moderate their respective terms. Each of them will have 20 minutes, and after the last intervention, we shall have a time for discussion, when you may address questions or comments to the speakers. Well, I am going to introduce the first speaker, who is going to be Professor Sergio Fabbrini. And I'm going to try to summarize his long, very brilliant curriculum. Well, Sergio Fabbrini is currently director of the Luis School of Government in Roma, and professor of political science and international relations at Luis Guido Carle, where he holds a Jean Monnet chair in European institutions and politics. Between 2006 and 2009, he was the director of the School of International Studies at the University of Trento, of which he was also co-founder. Since 1996, he's a visiting professor of comparative politics at the University of California at Berkeley. Well, Professor Fabbrini has been awarded several prizes, just to mention some of them. In 2006, for instance, he was the first Italian scholar to be awarded the Amalfi European Prize for the Social Science. In 2009, he won the Filippo Bursio Prize for the Political Science, and in 2011, he was the winner of the Capalbio Prize for Europe. Well, he has lectured and taught in many countries, many institutions, academic institutions, in many countries of Europe, America, and Asia. He's the author of many publications, among books and articles. He's the author of hundreds of articles and essays in 7 languages, well, among other merits. Well, Sergio Fabrini, Professor Fabrini, is going to talk about a post-theological narrative. So you have the floor.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. I fear to have prepared a kind of Fidel Castro speech of 1 hour and a half, but fortunately many things have been said, so I am spare of being a kind of Cuban type of professor. So, but let me say, I took seriously my, as a student, what Daniel asked me to do. So what is a narrative for the European Union, and what kind of crisis this narrative in some way express? So this is, you see, I have a roadmap. I try to give my sample answer to this roadmap, assuming that a narrative is a rhetorical representation of a given process in which there are elements of justification as well. So you have elements of description, how things is going, but also element of normative assessment, how they should go. So in this narrative, I start from a very crucial assumption that the European Union is a union of states. And this is my fundamental point in the narrative. And for union of states, what is crucial is peace. Peace is not only the expression of, let's say, a solution of territorial interdependence. Peace can be re-elaborated, as I will try to do, also for dealing with more, let's say, recent aspects of political interdependence. So the European Union cannot be studied, interpreted, discussed as a state or as a state in the making, as many scholars, starting from Leipart, try to do. The European Union is a union by aggregation, not as a state, even federal state, which are state federal by disaggregation. So, and the European Union started as a peace pact between traditionally rival states. And peace was considered achievable through 2 intervening variables. One is economic growth, and the other was and is political democracy. So the narrative organized in Europe tried to connect peace with economic growth and political democracy. Friendship between the leaders of the traditional European state was not considered sufficient for guaranteeing peace. So the fact that De Gasperi, Schubert, Schumann, and Adenauer spoke German was not considered a sufficient condition for guaranteeing balance of power in Europe. So in this narrative, the role of economic growth and political democracy were justified by a convincing assumption. Rich and free countries do not make war to each other. It was a sort of ante litteram democratic peace theory. And if peace is the main aim of integration, again, I start from this assumption that we are dealing with a union of states, not with a state in the making, then all European states should be interested too and involved in the process of integration. And so this is the assumption and the presumption of this process. And since the first enlargement in the 1970s to the latest one in the 2000s, integration has been presented as an inclusive and expanding project. Inclusive and expanding. And on that basis, we have what I call the teleological narrative. Namely the idea that the EU is the outcome of a unitary process. All European states aim to be part of it. They really want, they crave to be part of it. The finalité is the same for all the states, although they can move at different speed. But the finalité is the same, and history is on our side. Europeans are very modest and they think that history is always on our side. So the teleological narrative of integration stressed this inevitability of the European process of integration. And of course, when you talk with the high priest, and the high priest might be in general member of the commission, civil servant, but also many of the politicians, the EU is considered a sui generis organization because, contrary to other organizations, is based on a normative power based on moral principles. We learn from history. So this teleological narrative has been called into question by what I call the multiple crises of the 2000s. The euro, of course, the refugee crisis, and the terrorism. So that is my introduction. So now I try to develop the argument based on these two intervening variables. One piece connected to economic growth, and the other one piece connected to political democracy. So let's see about economic growth. With the passage of time, peace faded away in the memory of Western and even Eastern European. This is the second, the fact that peace is no longer relevant for Eastern European is something that might be worry an observer. Anyway, and that happened notwithstanding the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. Economics has gradually taken the place of politics. Since the entrance of the UK, Scandinavian countries, and those, many of the Eastern European countries, the EU has come to be considered by large number of states as an economic community, as a kind of commercial republic, as a sort of market regime. This group of member states has claimed successful, formally and de facto, opt out from the most integrationist policy regime. EMU is an example, but also Justice and Home Affairs. It reinterpreted the teleological narrative in this term. Economic growth is now the aim of integration. The single market is acceptable as long as it is deliver better result than national market. So it's no longer the need, the aim, the mission of the European Union is to guarantee a peaceful management of the political interdependence, but just to create wealth. And in some way, this economic view has become a very popular and in some way, I would say, majoritarian view of democracy. Delivering efficiency and, for the new entrants, Eastern European countries, redistribution. These have become the pillar of a new narrative shared by a growing number of member states. So the legitimacy of the EU resides in the economic contribution to national communities. The single market, for some also for Euro area member states, the single currency, integration is a mechanism for rescuing the nation state from its weakness. So the interpretation was the European Union, in particular, as an economic project, is a way for rescuing the state, for making the state still a very powerful organization. Although internally differentiated, post-Maastricht European Union has been interpreted as a commercial republic coordinating various national democracies. And again, my argument is that the multiple crises of this decade has called into question the possibility to conjugate, to make coexistence between economic integration and political differentiation, economic and monetary integration and political differentiation. This combination is no longer possible. First, because the crisis has pitted the opt-out area against the EMU area. Second, because within EMU, the crisis has led to a deepening of interstate division. And moreover, this interstate division, especially within the EMU area, was coming to be structured through hierarchical relation. What we have within the EMU is the formation of not only a centralized economic regime, but the formation of hierarchical relation between creditor and versus debtor member state. EMU and Justice and Home Affairs have shown the difficulty of managing integration through coordination of national democracy. And this is the real dilemma of the situation. Solidarity has been substituted by conflict and rivalry between member states. Conflict and rivalry, the modern form of what I call in the past the war. Indeed, in my interpretation, the Grexit is the first war of interdependence in the modern era. The outcome has been the economic decline or stagnation of the continent, inability to deal with the migrants and refugees, and we have the recurrence to unilateral foreign policy. I am very critical from what I interpret of the position of France in answering to terrorism. Again, there is the attempt to get a role in the European Union to become hegemonic again, playing the role of the great power as it was between the two world wars. National democracy have shown to be incompatible with the economic, monetary, and political interdependence. This is the very first crisis that we have to deal with. So lacking the meta-narrative of peace, economic and political conflicts between national democracy have re-emerged, and Brexit is another example of that. Let's see the other side, political democracy. Democracy has been a powerful pillar of the teleological narrative. Integration was considered a condition for securing democracy at the national level. Indeed, all continental states had experienced authoritarian regimes, so they needed Europe as the antibody of our evil, of our domestic evil. So because democracy don't make war to each other, the teleological narrative has conceptualized Europe as an ever-expanding land of democracy, enlargement as the strategy for democratizing an undefined continent. We are still thinking that Turkey should be in, that all the Balkan states should be in, and probably we don't know exactly where to stop in this teleological narrative, where to put the border of what is called Europe. So the European Union is the restorer of national democracy. In order to deal with the weakness of national democracy at the domestic level, we use the European Union. So the democratic narrative has been, however, intimately ambiguous. The EU has protected and reinforced national democracy, but it has also reduced its sovereignty in many policy realms. So you have this paradox that emerges anytime you have an enlargement, that the countries that are enlarged are craving for entering the EU, and immediately, as soon as they enter in the EU, they suffer and protest for being spoiled by the EU. I suggest you to read the last declaration, I think was October 1st, of the Prime Minister of Croatia, and he said, I think that there is too much Europe. Europe is too united. I think we have to stop and go back. So he entered in 2013 in the European Union. And after 1 year and a half, he asked for going back. So this ambiguity was left to history to be resolved. So you talk with the high priest, you go to Brussels, talk with the commission, they say, history is on our side. Those ambiguities will be resolved. And several concepts were elaborated for helping history to solve European ambiguities, multi-level democracy, constitutional pluralism, new governance patterns, and so forth. But the multiple crises have called into question the ambiguity on democracy. The battle on national sovereignty has divided member states within the European Council and the Council and their national public opinion. So the example is the story that Daniel said before, Greece versus Germany. Constitutional pluralism and multi-level democracy have disappeared under the conflict of power and interest regarding the condition for financial aid, the allocation of refugees in the member state, or the policy for answering terrorism. When you are dealing with this very contested, high salient political issue, there is no longer the rhetoric of the teleological narrative. Hungarians don't want refugees. Poland don't want, the Polish elite doesn't want refugee, and so forth and so forth. So national democracy has become the red line that divides member states, not the intervening variable for appeasing them. Now national democracy is a problem, it's not the solution. National democracy is in question. That ambiguity now moved in direction of making difficult integration. So here I go to my post-teleological narrative, how you call that. So the EU multiple crises have made evident what already existed under the ashes of the teleological narrative. Integration has been differently interpreted by different member states. It's not a question of speed, as, for example, Jean-Luc Piris wrote in his recent book. It's not a question of speed. Member states differ in terms of finality. They have different view. For some of them, the integration should be just a market, an economic community. For others, should be a parliamentary state. For others, should be an intergovernmental union. So the teleological narrative has thus imploded, substituted by multiple narrative. So you have the narrative coming out from those who say, no, we just want to keep the market over there, and all the rest should go back to the member states. And others who say, no, it's fine integration as long as we control as national government it, which is the intergovernmental opinion that is now a majority opinion within the Eurozone. And then you have still the position of those who think that the parliamentary state in the making should have some chances to develop through, for example, the Spitzenkandidat. So these are different views, and they are not easily compatible. So economic growth and national democracy do not necessarily generate peace. Peace in a political science term, as a peaceful regulation of interstate conflict of interest. This is not left versus right. It's not a state. It's not a federal state where left and versus right is the main cleavage, to use Leipart. This is a union of states in which what matters is the conflict between states. Then you have also left versus right within the parliament, but not across the board. And in that sense, the concept of peace is crucial for understanding politics in the European Union and for making assumptions on politics in the European Union. So, and in some way, economic growth and national democracy, in my view, are no longer compatible. National democracy has become a constraint on governing economic and political interdependence. This is a huge challenge. So there is a gap between rhetoric and reality that has increased dramatically. So not only the teleological narrative has been weakened by different interpretation of economic growth and political democracy, but also the aim of integration, what I call peaceful regulation of interstate conflict, has become opaque. Peace, growth, democracy are no longer interconnected as they were presumed to be at the starting of the process of integration. So it is an entire construction, in my view, that is called into question, the construction that justifies the process of integration and give to the process of integration positive outcome, a plausible idea of its successful outcome. The narrative of a never-expanding and unitary process of integration has no empirical and, in my view, theoretical justification. It is not clear how to combine peace, growth, and democracy. But in any way, this combination is no longer granted. So growth requires economic and monetary interdependence. But the latter, economic and monetary interdependence, is incompatible with the preservation of national democracy, as even Tsipras had to realize. But national political elite do not accept to give up their own power, as Miguel said before. So peace, as peaceful regulation of interstate conflict, is again at stake. And this is why I said that the Greek crisis is the first war of interdependence in the European continent. I run to my conclusion. So the multiple crises have created the need of a new narrative. So we have, I don't want to enter, I wrote a book and then I will show you in which I try to give some institutional ideas for dealing with this crisis, but just I remain on the Daniel suggestion to work on narrative. So what we need is to first to consider in some way, to be realistic enough that history is not on the part of integration. This is crucial. I say to my young students, history is not on the part of integration. Integration can collapse. We have always thought that integration is an expanding project. And we have a theory of integration. We don't have theory of disintegration. And we are dealing now with disintegration. So we have to escape from this paradigm that history is with us. Integration is the outcome of successful politics, not the inevitable outcome of history. And so the idea is how to combine those views, those different views, and how to deal with the fact that there are pressure for integration, but also pressure for disintegration. In Europe, there are already multiple unions. I do understand that many don't want to recognize that, particularly in Brussels, but there are multiple unions already. And so a post-teleological narrative should accommodate those different views, not refraining from identifying contrast and incompatibility between them. So some of the questions raised by David Cameron are there. We have to find a way of making possible the coexistence between a euro area and a non-euro area member state within a union. So that this is not propaganda. This is a question of conflict of interest that you should recognize. But within, in particular, the euro area, the political view of integration that should be organized around the euro area should be based on anti-hierarchical logic. Democracy is not domination. And I say that not only to the German or to the larger member state. You cannot make a union of states if you do not recognize that that union of states is an aggregation of states of different size, different population, different capability, different political economic model, different administration, different language, different culture. We cannot make a German-based Euro Union. Democracy is non-domination between individuals as well as between states. And we do union because states, I would like to challenge this view, we do a union because states are not able, remaining independent, to manage interdependence. Just those who want to go back to the repatriation of power at the national level should show a plausible argument that they can renationalize in politics to manage interdependence. This is some of the questions that Miguel already raised. If that is not possible, then we have to enter in a different perspective. But when we enter in a different perspective, we cannot build a state for substituting the nation state. The union is not a substitution of the nation state. It's something else. It's a union of states, not a new state in the making. So this is my let's say, aim in terms of theory and analysis, that we have to create a post-teleological narrative that should reflect the fact that already the European Union is fragmented, that we have already a multiple unions, and probably we can recognize this plurality in the European continent in a more realistic way, but also in a more successful way. Thanks very much. Okay, many of the questions are in this book. Sorry. Don't worry.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
I have to. I can do that.
No,
can you do that?
it's fine. I think mine is here. I'm sorry.
Perfect.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Fabrini, for your thoughts and views about new narratives. I would say post-integration narratives. The challenge is indeed how to accommodate all of them to move forward, yes. Well, sure, there will be afterwards there will be some questions and comments from the audience. Well, we continue with the second topic. So I am going to introduce the speaker. She's Neus Torbisco Casal. I'm going to try to summarize also her curriculum. Well, Dr. Torbisco is currently a lecturer on human rights and multiculturalism at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, but she's also academically linked to the University of Pompeu Fabra. She's currently on a leave, right? Well, she has a degree in law from the University of Barcelona and a PhD. She's PhD in law from the University Pompeu Fabra. Well, Dr. Torbisco has been, she is currently also a visiting scholar and a guest lecturer in several American and European academic institutions, such as, for instance, the King's University in Canada, the University of Puerto Rico, the New York University School of Law, Harvard Law School, and the London School of Economics, where she carried out between 2007 and 2009. She carried out a research on legal pluralism at the law department in the London School of Economics. Well, she's the author of many publications. Just to mention some of them, she's author of the book. Is it book? No. Group Rights as Human Rights: A Liberal Approach to Multiculturalism, published by Springer in 2006, and the second edition is of this year, 2015. Well, she's a member of a project from the Yale Law School about constitutionalism and political theory in Latin America. She's also a member of an interdisciplinary research group on immigration from the University Pompeu Fabra, and also she's a member of the International Society of Public Law, among other merits. Well, and Dr. Torbisco is going to talk about also a very important and interesting topic about building trust and solidarity across Europe towards a pluralist model of integration. You have the floor, Neus.
Well, thank you very much for such a generous introduction. And also I would like to, first of all, thank the organizers and the institutions here, the Institute for Governance and the European Institute of a University, the LSE, that was for a while also my academic home. And also, well, especially to Daniel Ineriti to invite me to this beautiful city, which I hadn't seen before, so there's another plus. I'm going to, let me see how is it, okay, okay.
Well, you have to take this off.
Sorry, okay.
No.
Okay.
And now.
Okay, so sorry about that. In a speech given to the European Parliament back in 1994, the then President of the Czech Republic, Mr. Václav Havel, contended that the most important task facing the European Union at the time was to come up with a clear reflection on the meaning of European identity, as well as an articulation of European responsibility. Europe's ethos or spirit, he claimed, was hard to see behind the mountains of monetary, technical, and administrative measures. This was 1994. Certainly, the European construction has proceeded throughout the last 2 decades at a resolute pace, and a remarkable level of integration has been achieved, quite surprisingly, both institutionally and economically. So this is more a positive story than the one maybe we've heard before, and I think we should remark also this. Despite the challenge that was posed in this speech, remains, in my view, largely unaddressed. Of course, an integration process that was aimed to breaking down significantly the borders, the boundaries, if you want, territorial and cultural, that once separated the European peoples could not be exempted from tensions and strains. This would be illusionary. So issues of citizenship, identity, and democratic legitimacy have constantly lurked behind the successive revisions of the treaties and the widening of the scope of the European Union action and institutional responsibilities. However, a degree of this European skepticism, despite it has been always present in public opinion, has never threatened so much the project as, I will say later, seems to be the case now. To put it somewhat simplistically, progressives have always tended to be preoccupied with the elitist bias of supranational integration, not just the EU, but any form of global democracy, and thus stress the problems of democratic legitimacy besetting the European project, including its potential to undermine collective autonomy and citizens' political participation and control over the rules that bind them, which is, in the end of the day, the purpose of any democracy. Instead, conservative skepticism usually focuses much more on the threat that supranational integration poses to national identity and national interests. So far, however, as I said, these divides haven't managed to undermine or threaten the whole project, and despite all internal crises, the European Union remains somehow as a solid, relatively solid edifice, even though a very unconventional one. So, as we know, this building, like the Guggenheim here in this, embodies features that are make you feel uncomfortable because it doesn't seem clear whether this is and it's never been whether this is an intergovernmental organization and which are the traits of federal states. To be sure, enduring disagreements over its ultimate aims and principles, over the soul of the European Union, as somebody put it this morning, now I can't remember who it was, but Robert Cohen recently in a talk he gave said the same. There is no soul to be seen in Europe. Do have influenced the eclectic form in which integration has developed. To use this architectonical metaphor, rather than a clearly defined edifice with solid foundations, the European Union remains a site under permanent construction. Look at the beautiful cranes, which I had seen always since I was born, and they threaten with never disappearing. So we must look at such disarray in a bit of despair. Okay? As lawyers, we tend to do this. We look at things that are not solid and doesn't correspond to domestic concepts or to known categories as in this shaky sense. So we could try to make sense of these constitutional institutions or mutations or reforms. The choice of terms also depends on the analyst, often borrowing from domestic concepts of theories. So the lack of a unifying narrative about the European Union political identity and aims, on the one hand, might be seen as inevitable. Yet somebody could think that this is a transitory trait. We could think that the cranes will finally disappear, and then the beautiful building will remain. However, we could also see the hybrid, undefined, and the construction nature of the Union, as well as the contested narratives that justify its existence, not as a threatening challenge to be resolved, a bit in the line that Sergio was saying before, but in a most positive light, in a realistic side. This is like this. It's not just La Sagrada Familia, but it also comes with the cranes. And despite this, tourists keep visiting. Anyway, so making a virtue out of necessity, one could think that this allows the flexibility to face the constantly emerging challenges through creative institutional variations and reforms, thus increasing the potential to solve problems and accommodate differentiated forms of integration and commitment to the Union. So this could be something not necessarily negative. It might be that at the end of the day, the true nature or soul of the Union is precisely not to have one. To put it in an essentialist non-essentialist terms. So the nature consists precisely in not having a clear narrative. That is, in preserving certain eclecticism, permeability, that allows for respect of deep diversity characteristic of Europe, and it favors a sort of pragmatism that better fits the kind of relations that actually predominate in the 21st century, according to social psychologists. So, well, sorry. This says, today, people, we are going to review our commitment to the planet. So it was just meant to illustrate that we can revise any type of commitment, even the most basic ones, and this seems to be a characteristic of the way in which we relate in a more postmodern society. So the virtues of what some American commentators call European pragmatism, including flexibility and adaptability to tackle internal crises, might account for the capacity of the European Union to overcome critical moments, such as the failure of the so-called constitutional treaty when French and Dutch citizens rejected the ratification of the treaty in 2005. Far from abandoning the key reforms, after a period of impasse, many of the crucial changes were anyway incorporated in the Lisbon Treaty. However, this way of overcoming the crisis, leaving aside, if you want, the grand design and focusing in solving the little problems, which allow granting specific accommodations and the right to exit and differentiated forms of integration, has also its shortcomings. A crucial one, as it has been stressed in the morning session, can come at the cost of widening the sense of citizens' alienation from the European Union institutions. Hence, a crucial question arises as to whether the building is sustainable over the long term. So, the absence of principle-based and unifying narratives, in the absence of this, both integration and disintegration are often justified instrumentally. And this is a big part that I wanted to engage in my talk, but that it now overlaps significantly with what Carlos Closa said this morning. So the pragmatic attitudes and this threaten sustainability because commitment becomes essentially strategic, subjected to variations of interest, and the narrative is increasingly used as a mere rhetorical device that in fact doesn't have a real impact on the minds of people. So there is a cost in this narrative. The building must be beautiful, but maybe at some point it will crumble because, and this is a nice hotel, because it was too liquid. It was not solid enough. So when this can happen, and this is, I think, the moment where we are, the building can be ephemeral, like some exhibitions are nowadays, because it's too cold. It doesn't provide a real home for the times of crisis. This is a situation in which I think we are immersed. So the economic crisis, together with other pressing issues, both global and local, such as the rise of previously unseen phenomena of global terrorism and the refugee crisis, has provoked, and surprisingly, in a union that is not comes from a deep commitment, the base for the rise of new forms of populism, some overly xenophobic, that threaten what we once thought as Central European values. The rise of xenophobia in Europe is quite remarkable, as all studies show, for instance. On the other hand, minorities of different sorts, religious, cultural, national, as well as states with frail economies like Greece, have come to perceive the strengthening of the European institutions as a veiled hegemonic project, as a project that is not neutral but bears the character and protects only the interest of powerful states and groups, the idea of domination. As a result, European skepticism today is not anymore marginal or exclusive of right-wing conservative political parties, but it's gaining ground among emerging left political parties that were founded in the aftermath of the movement of the 15th of March, of all the protests against widening inequality and the bureaucratization of politics. By resisting this conventional discourse about the virtues of the Union, these groups try, in fact, to reassert the right to a real democracy, which means a project of non-domination of one group over others, or some groups over others. Perhaps more than any other episode, and I'm not going to go through this, but the Greek sovereign debt crisis illustrates this broadening perception. The idea that by leaving the economy or by making the European Union govern in like a Saint-Simonian fashion, like leaving the economy to bankers and bureaucrats, we are risking fairness. And leaving to bankers, essentially, the decisions that deeply affect the way that people live. So the point is how, at this point, is then why is one of ecology. Why to preserve this union? What's the point? And I think it's a very legitimate point. Different reasons have been given during the morning, so part of what I thought I would talk about, it's been already said. So the issue of output legitimacy is one important one. So we want the union because it delivers. However, as some of you have already pointed out, this is not, doesn't seem to be the case. For many people, the union precisely didn't deliver. It's not improving fairness or the way of life of its citizens, and this drives Euroscepticism also from the left. One of the problems is to solve the issue of whether we need a more principle-based approach, and which would be this principle-based approach. This has been also dealt with by many people, but the risk is that unless we have this narrative, we run the risk that we only have what Bob Cohen calls a nominal democracy in Europe, something that it's an empty rhetorical device. However, which should be the narrative is unclear. Why? Because democracy, in a sense, is a cooperative enterprise. And cooperation, as many political sociologists like Fukuyama or Eric Uslaner or even Robert Putnam has said, requires a type of glue, the glue that trust provides. Without trust, there cannot be intergroup trust. There cannot be enough solidarity to overcome critical moments. So the building can last in the good times, like the European Union building has lasted over the 90s perfectly well, because there were not strong, big economic problems. But the building risk to crumble or to decay once you need a stronger, deeper level of cooperation that requires a non-strategic form of trust. What Fukuyama calls a non-strategic altruistic form of trust, or Eric Uslaner too, that talks about moralistic trust. So moralistic trust is different from a strategic trust, in that in a strategic trust, we look at the costs and benefits of cooperation. And what are we going to get from this cooperation? Cooperation in Europe doesn't have results that are short-term. Democracy, human rights, well-being is not something that one can experience right away by cooperating, by signing this treaty. And as Williamson and other famous rational choice economists have said, rationality is not easy to apply with common projects because there are too many risks. So risk assessment is very difficult to do in a rational way. And since we cannot calculate, because there is these limits of rationality, the more rational thing is not to cooperate in a situation of distrust. All social analysis show that distrust has increased radically in Europe since the crisis. And it's not only a problem of the European Union, it has also increased within the European Union states. And the question is that without this glue of altruistic trust, it's very difficult to ask people to cooperate, to be deeply committed to a project in which they don't believe in the sense in the deeper sense that what Fukuyama calls the emotional bonds make you cooperate in an altruistic form. This is, I think, the point that liberal nationalists, such as Will Kimlicka or Margaret Moore or other political theorists have when they say that the traditional liberal state, which created a myth of common, not common boundaries, but common bonds, the bonds are important. So the question is how to create the bonds so that trust could be resilient in times of crisis. And this is not easy, because all the experiments show, for instance, the World Values Survey of a year ago asked whether people felt they were cosmopolitan, their cosmopolitan alliances, and whether they felt that they were citizens of the world. Okay? So the answer, it's positive in a sense. Many European citizens feel more citizens of the world than American citizens. So in a sense, there is some success story in the European Union in the sense that people have been able through the Union to transcend the egoistic lack of solidarity typical of just the emotional type of bond. However, the ones who answer positively the question belong to the elites of society. So it's typically elites, intellectual elites, bureaucratic elites, which think of themselves as European. It's a significant amount of people because there are so many bureaucrats in Europe and so many students who travel, and so many, but still it's the elite. So the question is how to expand these bonds so that people come to perceive themselves as this. Only through this, in my opinion, only through a more principle-based narrative, you can provoke these more resilient bonds, not just with a pragmatic narrative, which has its positive sides, as I said, flexibility, permeability, and so forth. But it cannot last when the building faces collapsing. So one possible answer, one could say, well, so what's the point in preserving the European Union? Well, one possible answer is when political sociologists have explored the alternative forms, the alternative sources of trust beyond the idea of belonging together, we belong together, we are one, demos, the alternative has been institutional fairness. So, for instance, there are many studies that in Scandinavian countries, non-partisan politics and the perspective that the institutions are fair to all provoked during the 80s an increasing a change of this trust towards trust. So when citizens think of the institutions as non-dominant institutions that are representative of all and increase fairness, then people trust, that tends to increase the trust on those institutions. In this sense, we could say that not only we don't need to dismantle the European Union, but we need to empower even more its institutions, but empower them on a way that they don't represent only the powerful groups, the powerful states, but they do represent what some other participants have claimed, they represent the people and the diverse peoples that belong to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neus, for your interesting lectures and your ideas about the European building, the European Cathedral. Well, I think both lectures have completed one another. And anyway, we have already many ideas, keywords, integration, disintegration, trust, distrust in times of crisis. I think we have a lot of reference to start already the discussion. So now is the time for any questions or comments from the audience. Here there is a question from Carlos.
So thank you very much. Sergio, I have perhaps two small questions and a bigger one. The first small question is in reality a suggestion. Looking at the title of your presentation, it doesn't look to me that you're speaking about post-teleological union. You're speaking rather about pluralist theology, teleology, right? In the sense that you have multiple ends, multiple finalities within the European Union. So I understand your presentation in a different way. I don't think we are in a post-teleological, rather we are in a plural theological, in the sense there are multiple ends associated with member states. This connects to the larger question, which is, I mean, if I understood rightly, your concept of peace is something equivalent to a lack of conflict. Peace is a very strong concept, and I think basically is the absence of war. And what I was perhaps hinting at your presentation is the lack of conflict. Now, conflict is the essence of politics. So if I am reading correctly your presentation, rather what you are making is a assessment that now conflicts between states has become the central of the European Union, which is pretty natural. In a way, what you are saying basically is that the European Union has been politicized or repoliticized along national lines. So in that respect, I wonder if politicization is the real outcome and the real description, what is really your proposal to resolve, or to, not to resolve, sorry, to channel this conflict? Because you, on the other hand, have argued in the past very strongly against intergovernmentalism. But if I read correctly your assessment now, conflict among states is basically something which is defined in intergovernmental terms. So perhaps I am doing a kind of wrong assumption. The third question, very briefly. When you claim that Cameron's demands to discuss the relation between euro and non-euros is a fair one, it is a fair one from the point of view of the different interests at stake, from the point of view of conflicts. But I don't see, from a different angle, why this stands on a higher moral ground, on a higher principle that, for instance, discussing the question of the refugees quotas in which the British government has opted out of it. In terms of principles, in terms of interest, it's perfectly clear to anyone why this is the case. But in terms of principles, why on the agenda we should discuss the relation between euro and non-euro, and we should not discuss the question of distribution of refugees among different member states. And then I have a question, if I have time for news. I like it, your presentation, but I have a small passing. At a certain point, you were arguing in the lines of liberal nationalism with Kilnica and others, and it is true that the construction, what I think is your construction of the notion of trust and social capital seems to be related to this kind of thinking. Now, empirical studies, as much as this line of thinking relies on sociological conditions, sociological conditions tell you something which is totally evident, that some kind of bonds which are not reflexive, which are not rational necessarily, support trust. And that's sociological, that's empirically true. But that is very different to raise that to the level of normative imperative, which is something you did afterwards. And you introduce a kind of Habermasian take here. So I was detecting a kind of a small contradiction between the two basic tenets in your paper. And I wonder whether you could elaborate that, particularly how you reach institutional fairness from the liberal nationalist position when you are asking that from a Habermasian position. So it's a kind of puzzling, contradictory position. I wonder whether you could elaborate and clarify that point. Thank you.
I have a question for Neus. I think I agreed with much of what you said, but I was thinking at what point whether all what you said, and especially the end of building this trust, transnational trust in Europe, is still compatible with state nationalism. Because what we have now is, so I have two questions actually. So the first one is, if we have, as probably you would agree that we still have today, many states or all states promoting a nationalist, statal view of Europe, right? So when they approach the European Union and the institutions, one of the main questions is always what I can get from the EU as a Spanish citizen, right? Or as a French, or as a, so, and when you have this approach, and especially you have, nation building programs in each state, etc., in the educative system and things like this, to what extent all this is compatible actually with building some kind of transnational social trust? And So that's the first question. And the second question is, so you said at some point that, you know, this kind of cosmopolitan allegiance is just something that comes from the elites, right? But at the European level, that's not what I see, actually. I mean, it's not that only the elite feels European. I mean, there's this very famous case about the 1 million babies that have been born of Erasmus couples, right? So people who have met another person during their Erasmus program, well, a fraction of these couples have had babies, and the estimation by the European Commission is that they are 1 million, right? So I guess that, I mean, all these couples who are parents of Erasmus babies, as they are called now, I think, I mean, they are not the elite. We have huge numbers of people who are having this experience of living and working and traveling. I think it was Jan this morning who said that, well, you could say that he's the elite, but he was living in Prague and working in London, and I think that is more and more common. So I don't think, maybe it's not totally widespread, and maybe not everyone experiences the European Union in the same way, but I think, I mean, the intensity of all these contacts is quite remarkable.
So short, really short question for Neus, and actually it links somehow with Jose Luis' first question. I was wondering, and thanks for the presentation, both of you actually. I was wondering whether, yeah, if I get properly your argument, you were proposing that we should create more fair or fairer institutions at the European level so that they generate trust on the citizens towards the rule or they exercise authority. So I was wondering what happens when those citizens actually conceive themselves that their institutions in terms of member states are actually providing them fairer solutions than the European Union. Then how should we balance this, let's say, contradiction of trusts between the trust towards the European institutions and the trust towards the state-level institutions? Because at the end of the day, we will still have the interdependencies. So if I'm a Hungarian citizen, I might consider that Hungary deals better with, for whichever reason, with immigrants, but the truth is that empirically that's not true. So, but still you can have more trust on your institutions.
Bueno, yo pido perdón por llegar tarde y voy a leer lo que creo que se debe hacer para combatir el paro juvenil. Y creo que se tenía que retornar al servicio militar obligatorio, tanto mujeres y hombres, milicias de verano para estudiantes, 2 campamentos de verano de 3 meses y 4 meses de prácticas. Servicio militar remunerado a los que aprueben y consigan especializaciones de cocinar, bordar, hacer punto, idiomas, manejo de bici. Las bicicletas deben estar aseguradas y matriculadas para evitar robos. Natación, paracaidismo, motos, sacar carnet, coches, camiones, autobuses, excavadoras, retroexcavadoras, motoniveladoras, helicópteros, ultraligeros, avionetas, parapentes. Lo tengo todo escrito y va a ser rápido, ¿eh? Entonces, todo el mundo gana, todo el mundo gasta con ticket y todo el mundo paga la hacienda. Segundo, Boy Scouts, campamentos de verano, restauración de pueblos abandonados.
Please.
Realizar...
¿Cuál es la pregunta? La pregunta.
No, la pregunta es que quiero eliminar para combatir el paro juvenil en España y en Europa, vamos.
Sí, pero no estamos hablando.
¿No estamos hablando?
No, de
No.
ese tema ahora no. Estamos hablando de nuevas narrativas, nuevos
Nuevas
modelos
narrativas,
para
pues tengo
la
proyectos.
integración
Sí,
europea.
pues sí, pues
Entonces
tengo.
estamos en el
sí,
límite del tiempo,
sí, pues
hay
un
ya
segundito.
preguntas formuladas.
Tengo
y hay que
el desarrollo del tren bala de levitación magnética que puede conseguirse 1000 kilómetros por hora. Yo esto lo he desarrollado en Brasil, y entonces, mediante túneles, un túnel de doble sentido, se consiguen eliminar el CO2.
Muy bien. Bueno, igual después de acabar esta sesión podemos hablar de todo eso. Muchas
Lo tengo todo
gracias.
escrito y, o sea,
Bueno,
no...
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Yo creo que ya tenemos bastantes preguntas, ¿verdad? Entonces, igual brevemente contestamos a... Sí. Muy bien.
Thank you. So thank you very much for your questions that are very challenging. I mean, this is a very rough draft, because what I've been working in part is on the issue of how to expand trust beyond the, how you can have trust building without nation building. And this is not just in the European Union, but which are the impediments to cooperation in a world where all the empirical assessments demonstrate there is a growing distrust among citizens. So how you can cooperate in conditions of growing distrust is very challenging. And therefore people turn to rationalistic approaches of calculation, or they just trust those who they knew. I didn't reclaim the, as for the liberal nationalism, it's not that I reclaim the narrative as in itself as a normative account. What I think is a very important point of the liberal nationalist literature of the 90s is the idea that so far the state has been able to transcend the differences and the cultural and linguistic and value differences among their citizens, and create the myth, as David Miller says, that we belong together. In situations of crisis, the idea that we belong together, this doesn't mean that it is rational or anything, it's just an account of social psychology, provokes that people are much more willing to be altruistic, to share the resources with the others. And the question is that in the state, this is also a myth. We should remind that this didn't exist before the French Revolution. So the liberal revolutions, what they did is to recreate the myth, now repeated after the Paris attacks, that we are one nation. Okay, and this myth, which is absolutely a myth, because this nation was created through many, many exclusions and significant unfairness and lots of blood that was that had to be sacrificed. But so this was not like a peaceful process or anything, but it had the positive output that people they belong in this myth. That's the positive kind of transformative thing about myth. And therefore, they are more ready to cooperate with others in times of crisis. I think the question of the crisis in Europe has made it clear that the Germans don't think that the Greeks belong together with them. Okay? Or in Spain, that the Catalans, many Catalans think that it's not that we belong together, and therefore we need to reassess the sources of legitimacy. Of course, this model of trust that is more rationalistic, it will never be so deep, as Bob Cohen says. Altruistic trust is only a patrimony, he said provocatively, of moralists who think that they're cosmopolitans, who think, well, Kantians who have a strong morality, but we haven't seen this moralistic trust very expanded throughout history, and therefore we need to be realistic and think that cooperation beyond the state sometimes can even lead to sacrificing democracy, because then it can be the patrimony of private corporations, of people who don't represent any demos, because the demos remains to be seen, and therefore we have to be careful in being cosmopolitans. So I agree with Josep Luis, and I'm one who at home speaks 4 or 5 languages, we don't know anymore, who have a German husband and live in Geneva, and I don't know, and I'm in this linguistic mess, and therefore, so maybe the Erasmus programs promote this, but statistically, I'm still a minority, a very strong minority in this sense. So the World Value Survey shows, for instance, that indeed those who have travel, who work in international institutions, tend to be much more open-minded, much more empathetic to others. Because the question is one of empathy. So you tend to be more solidaristic and you tend to trust more those whom you know. And this, Ericus Lanner has made lots of empirical assessments, and it seems clear that we tend to distrust those who don't look like us. That's the problem with racism, and this is quite clear. So heterogeneity and diversity creates distrust, and this is an essentialist division at the supranational sphere. I don't say that this means that we have to return to the old-fashioned nation building of the 19th century. The only thing I wanted to claim, and this is to address also Carlos' question, it's not that I claim this as a normative narrative, but I think liberal nationalists have promoted a good account of why it was possible to consolidate the state despite the diversity and heterogeneity that was in the French territory, that at the time, at the time of the revolution, nobody spoke French in France except from Paris and a bit beyond Paris. And after a few years, everybody thought of themselves as French. So the nation is also another myth. The question is how to, but it had a positive side. In a sense, it had a positive side that we believed in this myth, and therefore now, in this room, maybe I feel closer to Josep Lluís because we share more an identity that to somebody whom, for instance, I don't know from where it comes. This is just it's not normative. I think it's just a social psychology. So I think we should take seriously the liberal nationalist objection to the global democracy, like many skeptics who say, well, it's very nice as a moralistic Kantian ideal, this global democracy construction, but now tell me how to do it. Because people have a limited degree of empathy. And it was clear the other day after the attacks in Paris, because I live in France, well, close to Geneva now, and it was very clear that a few days before there were massive attacks in Beirut, and it was clear the Europeans were not moved in the same way by the attacks in Beirut than by the attacks in Paris, because we tend to empathize much more with those than who know. So the challenge is how to make people more empathetic beyond their borders. And in this sense, I find we cannot engage into a global nation building construction like in the 19th century. So we don't have any more options, I think, that trust in the institutions. So institutions in themselves promote trust. And this is what many Scandinavians, or in Canada, for instance, Patti Lenard has written a thesis about how institutional trust building, how when people increase trust, when they see that institutions promote fairness. And fairness in the sense of non-domination. So we need maybe more European institutions, but institutions that are much more representative, fair, in the sense that I'm sure Josep Lluís tomorrow is going to insist, deliberative, accountable, that behind the institutions there is a clear distributional fairness, deliberative quality, and so forth. So we would need major institutional reform. But I would claim that the only route to promote more trust is to change the institutions, not to dismantle them, but to change them. Because it's unthinkable that in the 21st century we could engage into a national trust building that we say, well, now we all speak English, we eliminate all languages, and now from now on we are citizens of the world. No? In a sense, this is what the states did before.
Professor Fabrini, very briefly, please.
Okay, thanks, Carlos, for the question. I mean post-teleological in the sense that I think I would suggest not to assume that history goes in the direction of integration, okay? But also don't assume that the pluralist Europe that I try to describe is going to persist. I think that the capacity to make that pluralist Europe persisting depends on politics. But when I talk about politics, I talk about something that is unpredictable. I talk about political leadership, political culture, and so forth. So post-ideological means that we have to put our boots in the ground and look there, problem by problem, how to solve and to deal with those challenges. The second question, peace is in the classical, I use in the classical, let's say, international relation, is the peaceful regulation of conflict, not the lack of conflict. So peaceful regulation of conflict. And in my view, is that we had this first war of interdependence, is a paradoxical, of course, but a push that, to a certain point, is not so paradoxical. I would say that July 2015 was not just a promenade, it was just a real war of interdependence between Greeks elite from one side and the other member state of the Eurozone from the other side, in particular Germany, that raised the issue of expelling Greece from the Euro area. That kind of lack of peaceful regulation of conflict coming, in my view, from a lack of institutional design. And here I go back to noise. We arrived to, I want to make a long story short, but we have to really to understand the institutional matter. We decided after Maastricht to bring important core state powers from the nation state to the European level. So we brought defense, foreign policy, military policy, and economic policy at the European level. But where we decided to do that? We decided to do that at the condition of keeping the member state government in control of those policies. We didn't bring those policies in the community method. We created a different kind of method that I call an intergovernmental union. Now, the question is that the intergovernmental union is institutionally unable, because of the unanimity criteria that regulate its functioning, is institutionally unable to solve the conflict of interest between states. And in that sense, the first war of interdependence is not just the outcome of an inevitable clash of interests between Greeks and Germans, but is the outcome of the fact that the intergovernmental union cannot work. Because if you rely on the consent of 19 ministers and prime minister, it is very difficult to find solution to collective action problems. So in that sense, we enter in a paradox, that exactly the paradox that you raised. Those core state power, let's say economic policy, now look at France, defense and military issue are highly salient in political terms. They raise politicization, as certainly consumer protection does not raise. So the government said these are very salient political issues. We want to control them. And we want to control them through this voluntary coordination based on consensus. So the French said to the German, you have to be there, although you can be more numerous than us, you can be more significant than us in the European Parliament. Around the table, each of us has a veto power. But it didn't work. So, and that created a conflict, exactly as the balance of power after the First World War created a conflict, because it was a wrong political institutional design. So conflict come out from failure of human beings in designing the way of regulating them. Because conflict, as you said rightly, are always there. What makes the difference from one conflict to another is that one conflict can be regulated and doesn't generate war. Another conflict is not well properly regulated and can generate war, or in this case, conflict again. I hope that there will not be conflict in that sense. So I would say probably we have to discuss better about the reform of that intergovernmental union, that we have to introduce element of hyper-qualified majority voting, something like that, because if in the lack of this institutionalized procedure, then what matters is the fact that Germany is Germany, and Greece is a small country. At the very end, the independence of Cyprus is nothing vis-à-vis Germany. And it's absolutely incredible for me that Cyprus did not understand that. But at the very end, what matters is the fact that Germany is the larger creditor member state. And in the lack of proper rules, what matters is power. So I would have expected that Tsipras, instead of to ask for a referendum of his own people, would have asked for changing the rules, because the rules are the only device that can protect the weaker. And in that sense, I think that Tsipras people failed dramatically in understanding the relation between power and rules. The third question is about Cameron. Well, I think Cameron is a good example of what we discuss all day long. I think with different accents, but everybody here recognize that there is a problem in keeping together national democracy and economic or monetary interdependence, especially when that interdependence has the form of integration, okay? When you face this conflict or with this, you can say, disharmony or not functioning relation, you have two options. The first option is to bring as many power as possible from interdependence to dependence, to national independence. And I would say that what Cameron is doing is try to go back to that road. I said before, it is up to Cameron, the people supporting him, to say that going back to national independence is compatible with the necessity to guarantee peace. I am not sure of that, okay? So what is doing Cameron is to ask to go back, to repatriate in some way, where other countries don't have the courage to say we have to go towards a better institutional design of political interdependence. So my suggestion is to use Cameron's window of opportunity for opening up the discussion. I think that he raised something that I agree with you, why the British couldn't take some Syrian refugee anyway, but this is an occasion for opening up a discussion. Which are where is the border between national independence and political interdependence? Let me make a finish, but the question of trust, of course, the question of trust is an obsession for political and social scientists, because trust is a scarce resource, right? It's a scarce resource in family, at least in my family. It is a scarce resource in a region, is a scarce resource in a state, so you can imagine in a union of states. But what matters in trust is that, as Noy said, trust is the outcome, it's not the premise. We cannot base on trust the condition for going on in a process of aggregation, being the family aggregation, the state aggregation. Trust is coming out from the proper functioning of institutions. Here we have, again, two sort of implicit biases. We tend to interpret the European Union, as Noy said, as a kind of nation building. And when we deal with nation building, we have two predominant models in Europe. One is the German model, and one is the French model. My argument is that both are worthless. Okay? The German model say, first you have to build up a demos, because that was the German experience. We have to build up a demos. On that demos, you create the condition for political trust, okay? But of course, that was a specific, peculiar experience of Germany, not the experience of other nation states, even of democratic side. We have many cases in which the demos was not a precondition, but was the outcome of a political process. I look to Christian, but just to say, I really, for me, it's incredible to understand why the German Constitutional Court does not recognize this historical fact. Okay, you spent 2 hours. Sorry, but tomorrow I cannot. I have to okay. So the other one is the French model, in which you say you create the public authority institution, and the authority institution oblige you to trust. So if you have a kid and live in Normandy, you cannot give him or her the name that you want, because there are certain names that still now in Normandy or in Bretagne are prohibited in order to create the trust. as Noyce said, but we are creating something different from a state. And if we don't escape from this idea, from this statist paradigm, it's impossible, in my view, to understand what is going on. But even more, it is impossible to make this process more plausible. A union of states has a huge problem of trust. The question of trust has to do with the fact that we speak different language, we have different religion, we have different tradition, with different habits. We cannot ask Europeans to trust each other in facing this huge process of creating a union of states. And we create a union of states not out of love. We create a union of states out of necessity. Okay? This is not a normative assessment. We are right to discuss about union of states because we did 2 world wars and we don't want to make a 3rd world war, right? So it is necessity that generates the need of a union. It's not love for the Spanish, the German, the Italian, and so forth. So the question of unions of states is to create trust between political elites, because union of states are based on political pact, not on other meta-political condition. It is based on the fact that I am an Italian, I learned to speak a lingua franca, but I'm still an Italian. And what makes me European, a member of the European Union, is to respect those rules for those specific policy, not more than that. On other policy, I respect the rule of my states, of my region, of my city. But if we have the idea of building a European Union, which is the replica of a nation state centralized, we generate a disaster, inevitably so. So we have to imagine that we create a union of multiple identity, not of one only identity, of multiple authority. What matters is to have a right, appropriate institutional design that defines what is proper of that authority and what is not proper of that authority. For example, the Eurozone is making a lot of confusion. It's impossible even to mobilize the subsidiarity clause because the same institution, the Council, the European Council, the ECOFIN Council, that take decisions are constituted by my own government. Can I make an appeal against my own government? Divide what is proper of the Union and what is proper of the nation state. And so ask me to trust the decision taken on behalf of the Union, not on behalf of Europe. So I trust those decisions as long as they are processed by proper institutions. Thanks.
Okay, well, it's time to conclude. We thank again the speakers for their contribution, and of course we thank you for your attendance, your interest, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.